No seatbelts, no helmets. Kids in the back of pickup trucks under the summer sky. America once ran on trust, risk, and a wild sense of freedom. But how did those rules shape the country we live in today? Life in mid-century America felt raw and unguarded. The 1950s through the 1970s carried an energy that today feels almost unrecognizable. A child could leave the house at sunrise with nothing more than a bike and a promise to be home before dark. Parents didn't need to track every step. They trusted the neighborhood, and they trusted their children to figure things out. Scraped knees and grass-stained jeans weren't considered failures of supervision. They were the marks of a childhood well spent. On warm evenings, the streets belonged to kids. They raced down sidewalks, built forts out of scrap wood, and turned empty lots into their own kingdoms. There were no cell phones buzzing in their pockets, no GPS trackers to mark their every move. The streetlight coming on was the only curfew, and even that rule bent on nights when the air was too good to waste indoors. For adults, life followed its own rhythm of trust and handshake agreements. Neighbors bartered over garden vegetables, borrowed tools without contracts, and lent out spare rooms when a friend needed a place to stay. The corner store clerk didn't demand ID for every transaction, and the butcher might slip an extra cut of meat into the bag just because he knew your family. These weren't exceptions. They were the rules of daily life. It was a world guided less by written law and more by community understanding. If a fence post fell, a neighbor helped you fix it. If a dispute broke out, it was often settled on a porch rather than in a courtroom. That doesn't mean there wasn't risk. There was plenty. A child standing in the bed of a moving truck faced danger that laws today would never allow. But at the time, that danger was invisible, folded into a broader sense of freedom. The roads themselves carried the same wild spirit. Seatbelts sat unused in most cars, if they were even installed at all. Motorcyclists felt the wind without helmets, their hair whipping in the air as though protection was an afterthought. Pickup beds overflowed with people, dogs, and fishing gear. It was dangerous, yes, but it was also alive, stitched into the culture of weekends and road trips. Looking back, it's easy to call it reckless, but in those years, it felt natural. Rules were not enforced by paper or patrol cars so much as by shared expectations. What mattered most was belonging to a family, to a neighborhood, to a way of life where people looked out for each other. That sense of belonging made the world feel both bigger and safer, even when it wasn't. But as the decades rolled on, America began trading wild freedom for structure, and rules became the new language of daily life. Sunset was the curfew. A streetlight turning on was the signal. Kids once ruled their own days until laws stepped in. In those years, childhood carried a freedom that today feels almost impossible to imagine. Parents didn't hover or plan out every hour. Instead, they opened the front door, let their children run, and trusted the world to do its part. There were no endless check-ins, no GPS trackers, no organized playdates scheduled weeks in advance. A child's schedule was written by the season, the weather, and the rhythm of neighborhood life. It wasn't too unusual for a kid to walk or bike miles away from home without anyone worrying. Long rides down gravel roads or city sidewalks felt like adventures, not dangers. They might head to the corner store with a few coins, spend the afternoon at the local pond, or wander into a field that seemed to stretch forever. Parents expected their children to come back hungry and tired, but not to call every hour to confirm their safety. Playgrounds reflected that same sense of independence. Metal slides that burned under the sun. Tall swings that launched kids almost into the sky. Merry-go-rounds that spun so fast they blurred. These weren't seen as lawsuits waiting to happen. They were seen as part of growing up. Scrapes, bruises, and even broken bones were accepted as the price of adventure. The idea that every corner should be padded or every piece of equipment inspected was still far in the future. What kept this system alive wasn't law. It was trust. Parents trusted that neighbors would step in if something went wrong. They trusted that strangers weren't all threats, but part of a community that looked after one another. The responsibility for a child's safety was shared by the whole neighborhood, not enforced by curfews or legal codes. The contrast with today is striking. Now, rules govern almost every corner of childhood. Cities enforce curfews for teens. Laws regulate playground design, making them safer but also less daring. Parents live under the weight of child protection standards, often judged harshly for giving kids too much freedom. Where once a group of kids roamed like their own tribe, today children are often driven from one supervised activity to the next, watched closely until they are home again. This shift brought safety, but it also brought structure, sometimes so much structure that childhood itself feels smaller. Independence, once a natural part of growing up, has become something parents must carefully weigh against rules and risks. Back then, kids were their own bosses. They answered to the sky, the street light, and the unspoken trust of the neighborhood. It was a freedom wild enough to feel limitless and ordinary enough to feel like nothing special. But kids weren't the only ones on the roads. Adults lived by their own daring rules too. Driving without a seatbelt wasn't rebellious. It was normal. And speed limits? Often treated as suggestions. For decades, American roads carried a spirit of freedom that now feels almost unthinkable. Cars rolled down highways without anyone buckled in, their passengers sliding across bench seats as the radio played. Children stood on the seats to get a better view, or rode stretched out across the back window shelf, lulled to sleep by the hum of the engine. The idea of clipping into a seatbelt was less about safety and more about inconvenience. Most drivers ignored them completely if their cars even had them installed. Open containers were another part of the picture. In many states, it was perfectly legal for someone in the passenger seat or even the driver to sip a beer while cruising down the road. Road trips often meant a cooler in the back, and nobody thought twice about it. It wasn't considered reckless at the time. It was just how things were done. Children, too, rode with a kind of vulnerability that laws would never permit today. Car seats, where they existed, were minimal and often used more for boosting a child's height than actually protecting them. Many kids simply rode on a parent's lap or bounced around freely in the back seat. Pickup trucks often carried entire groups of children in the bed, their hair whipping in the wind, their laughter echoing against the open road. Motorcyclists embodied the same attitude. Helmets were optional in many states, and riders often preferred the feeling of the wind in their faces over the security of a hard shell. A leather jacket and good reflexes were considered enough protection. For many, helmets weren't about safety. They were about freedom lost. But that freedom came with a cost. As cars became faster and roads busier, accidents rose sharply. Families who once thought of cars as symbols of independence were suddenly confronted with the dangers that came from so few rules. Emergency rooms filled with victims of crashes that might have been survivable with seatbelts or helmets. By the 1980s, lawmakers began to step in, tightening regulations and forcing a cultural shift that was long resisted. Still, the memory of those unregulated roads lingers. For older generations, there's a sense of nostalgia mixed with disbelief. How could something so dangerous have once felt so ordinary? The roads of the past represented more than transportation. They were an extension of America's untamed spirit, a place where risk was accepted as part of living fully. Freedom and safety collided on the asphalt. And while rules eventually made the roads more secure, they also marked the end of an era when travel itself felt wild and unchained. But while cars were loosening the rules, workplaces were another story where safety was still negotiable. No gloves, no goggles, just grit. Workplaces of the past often asked Americans to risk it all. For much of the 20th century, a job wasn't just about a paycheck. It was about survival, and survival often meant putting one's body on the line. Factories roared with machines that had no guards or shut-off switches. Construction sites dangled men high above the ground without harnesses or rails. In coal mines, lungs filled slowly with dust, and in shipyards, workers handled asbestos as casually as sawdust. There were few rules to protect them, only the unspoken understanding that danger was part of the bargain. Before the creation of OSHA in 1970, workplace safety was left largely to employers, and many looked the other way. Accidents were common, injuries expected. A missing finger, a chronic cough, or a back bend from years of lifting wasn't unusual. It was almost a badge of honor, proof that you had worked hard and endured. When someone was hurt, it was rare for the company to face consequences. Most often, the burden fell on the worker and their family to adapt. The risks extended across industries. In steel mills, molten metal poured dangerously close to unprotected feet. In chemical plants, toxic fumes drifted through the air without masks to filter them. Farmers sprayed pesticides with little more than a bandana tied around their faces. Every day brought the chance that a simple mistake, or even just bad luck, could mean disaster. And yet, generation after generation kept clocking in, because that's what life demanded. This acceptance of risk was embedded in the culture. Men were expected to endure, women to persist, families to adapt. That's just the job, people would say, as though broken bones or shortened lifespans were nothing more than part of the deal. Complaints were often silenced with the reminder that a paycheck was better than no work at all. Change came slowly, pushed forward not by the companies, but by the weight of tragedy and activism. Strikes, protests, and investigations began to shine a light on the human cost of unsafe workplaces. Families who lost loved ones demanded answers, and advocacy groups began to call for accountability. By the late 1960s, the public could no longer ignore the growing list of preventable injuries and deaths. In 1970, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration was created to enforce standards and hold employers accountable. It was a turning point that signaled a shift from a culture of silent endurance to one of regulated protection. For the first time, safety was seen not just as a personal responsibility, but as a shared obligation between worker and employer. Even with reform, the memories of those earlier years linger. The scars, both visible and hidden, are reminders of a time when labor demanded more than strength, it demanded sacrifice. And for many families, that sacrifice never truly faded. And if workplaces demanded risk, home life carried its own hidden dangers too. Cafes, airplanes, even hospitals, cigarette smoke floated everywhere. Nobody thought twice. For much of the 20th century, smoking wasn't just a habit. It was part of the atmosphere. A cloud of smoke hung in diners where waitresses carried coffee refills, drifted through bus aisles on cross-country trips, and lingered in hospital waiting rooms where anxious families sat. Ashtrays weren't hidden or frowned upon. They were fixtures built into restaurant tables, airplane armrests, and office desks. The smell of tobacco clung to coats, hair, and wallpaper, so constant that most people barely noticed it. In those years, smoking was tied to identity. Movie stars lit up on screen, making it look glamorous. Soldiers came home from war with cigarettes packed into their rations. Teenagers reached for them as symbols of adulthood, while parents smoked through family dinners without concern. Cigarettes weren't seen as dangerous. They were woven into daily life, as natural as a cup of coffee or a nightcap. Warning labels didn't appear until the 1960s, and even then they were small, tucked away on the side of the pack. By the 1970s, medical research had begun to uncover the serious risks, but changing public opinion was slow. Many dismissed the findings, convinced that smoking was simply part of American culture. Doctors themselves were often pictured with cigarettes in hand, giving the impression that it couldn't possibly be so harmful. What shifted the tide wasn't just the health of the smoker. It was the people around them. Secondhand smoke became the center of the conversation. Non-smokers sitting in offices, restaurants, and classrooms began to question why they were breathing in someone else's habit. Parents worried about children exposing cars and homes. Slowly, society began to reconsider what had once been normal. Campaigns against smoking grew louder, backed by science and public health organizations. The cultural image of cigarettes began to change. No longer glamorous, they were portrayed as dangerous, addictive, and deadly. Ads that once promised sophistication now carried stark warnings. Bit by bit, laws followed this shift. Smoking bans swept through airlines, schools, offices, and eventually restaurants and bars. The ashtrays disappeared, leaving behind only faint stains on tables where they had once rested. For many who lived through it, the change felt almost surreal. To look back at photographs of smoke-filled airplanes or crowded diners is to glimpse a world that seems reckless by today's standards. What was once ordinary is now unthinkable. The story of smoking in public places isn't just about health. It's about culture, perception, and the slow recognition that one person's freedom can come at another's cost. It shows how society decides who gets protected and when. But laws weren't just about safety. They also reflected who society chose to protect and who it didn't. Some laws weren't about freedom. They were about control. And they didn't treat everyone the same. For all the talk of liberty, mid-century America was still a place where many people lived under restrictions written into the very fabric of law. Segregation remained a defining reality in much of the country before the 1960s. Schools, buses, restaurants, and even water fountains were divided by race. Separate but equal was the legal standard, but in practice it meant exclusion, inferior resources, and a daily reminder of inequality. These weren't just social customs. They were laws enforced by courts and police, shaping the rhythm of life for millions of Americans. Other forms of restriction came quietly, tucked into rules that many accepted as normal. Blue laws kept entire towns shuttered on Sundays, limiting commerce and recreation to preserve religious traditions. Buying liquor, shopping for clothes, or even going to the movies could be off limits depending on the state or county. For families, Sundays became quieter by force of law rather than choice. While some cherished the pause, others felt the weight of regulation dictating their personal freedoms. Gender carried its own set of limitations. Well into the 1970s, many women were unable to open credit cards in their own names without a husband's signature. Certain jobs remained closed to them by law or company policy, justified by outdated ideas about who belonged in the workforce. These barriers weren't accidents. They were codified through policies that reinforced a hierarchy of who had access to opportunity and who did not. Even something as ordinary as a drink came under uneven rules. States set their own drinking ages, and crossing a border could shift what was legal or forbidden. College students often traveled to neighboring states to take advantage of looser restrictions, a patchwork of laws that highlighted how unevenly freedom was defined. For some, it felt like a rite of passage. For others, it revealed the arbitrary nature of control. Together, these laws painted a clear picture. Freedom in America was not universal. It was granted fully to some, withheld from others. And while many accepted these structures as part of daily life, growing movements began to challenge their fairness. The civil rights movement, women's rights advocates, and youth activists pressed for a redefinition of the law itself. Courtrooms, marches, and legislation became battlegrounds where the meaning of equality was fought over word by word. The legal landscape began to shift. Segregation was dismantled, at least on paper. Credit protections expanded. Workplace laws opened doors that had long been shut. Progress came slowly and unevenly, but it revealed a deeper truth. Laws don't just reflect culture, they shape it. And when laws exclude, they teach exclusion. As rights expanded for many, One unstoppable force would soon rewrite the rulebook again. One click replaced a whole day of errands. Technology didn't just change life, it forced lawmakers to catch up. The arrival of the internet in the late 1990s and early 2000s didn't just bring convenience. It upended the systems that had shaped American life for decades. Where once a trip to Main Street meant hours of walking from one store to the next, now a few keystrokes could order groceries, clothes, even furniture to your doorstep. The digital marketplace stripped away the barriers of distance and time, offering speed and efficiency on a scale no one had seen before. But the law wasn't ready. Old systems designed for face-to-face transactions struggled to keep up with a world where a buyer in Kansas could order from a seller in China without ever meeting. Questions of sales tax, shipping rights, and consumer protections suddenly became national debates. The same freedom that made the internet so powerful also created loopholes wide enough to drive whole industries through. Then came the darker side. Fraud spread quickly, hidden behind computer screens. Credit card scams, phishing emails, and online theft introduced crimes that law enforcement barely understood at first. Hackers broke into databases, stealing identities and exposing private information. For lawmakers, it was a race against time. How to regulate a world that was changing faster than they could write the rules. Privacy became the next battlefield. What once belonged to conversations in living rooms or offices now lived online, tracked and stored in ways most Americans didn't realize. Every search, every purchase, every late-night scroll through websites left a trail of data. Companies used it to sell more products, but governments began to ask, who should control that information? And how could people be protected in a world where their lives were increasingly digital? Consumer protections started to expand, but never quickly enough. New laws targeted online scams, required better security, and forced companies to be transparent about how data was used. Yet, even as protections grew, so did the power of technology. The rules always seemed one step behind the innovation. For those who remembered life before the digital shift, the contrast was striking. Gone were the days when shopping meant shaking the hand of a shopkeeper, or when a deal relied on trust built over years. Instead, transactions became faceless and instant. Convenience came at the cost of connection, and speed replaced the slower rhythm of community life. The digital shockwave wasn't just about technology. It was about how fast society could adapt to rules rewritten by screens and servers. The pace was dizzying, and for many, unsettling. America had once lived by handshake agreements and local trust. Now, it was passwords, encryption, and digital signatures. But even in this world of screens and rules, some Americans are looking backward for balanced farmers markets. Handwritten receipts, local shops. A quiet movement is bringing back pieces of the past. After decades of chasing speed and convenience, many Americans are turning back towards something slower, something simpler. It isn't loud or dramatic, it's a quiet rebellion, one rooted in memory and the desire to feel connected again. In small towns and even busy cities, weekend farmers markets line sidewalks where neighbors greet each other by name. Inside small storefronts, shopkeepers offer goods made by hand, not shipped by cargo containers. What once seemed outdated now feels refreshing, even radical. Part of this shift comes from a longing for tradition. The revival of old practices, baking bread at home, raising backyard chickens, or preserving food in glass jars, has become a way of reconnecting with what earlier generations saw as normal life. Homesteading, once a necessity, is now a choice for families who want to slow down and step away from the constant hum of digital life. The very habits once left behind are being rediscovered as treasures. Laws, too, are bending to nostalgia. In many states, restrictions that once banned small-scale brewing or distilling are being rolled back, allowing craft breweries and distilleries to flourish. Local markets that were once tightly regulated now enjoy exemptions, making it easier for artisans and farmers to sell directly to the public. It's a recognition that not all rules are timeless and that some freedoms from the past deserve a second life. The push isn't only about food or crafts. It's about community. People are realizing that shopping locally means more than just buying goods. It means investing in relationships, supporting neighbors, and reviving the sense of belonging that Main Street once gave. The dollar spent at a farmer's market carries more than economic weight. It carries emotional value. Nostalgia plays a powerful role in this transformation. The sound of a cash register bell, the texture of a paper receipt, the smell of fresh produce at a roadside stand all trigger memories of a time when life felt more grounded. These sensory connections remind people that progress isn't only measured in efficiency, it's also measured in meaning. This quiet rebellion isn't about rejecting the modern world entirely. Few would trade away the comfort of online banking or the safety of modern medicine. But many are searching for a balance, a way to keep the best of both worlds. The convenience of technology alongside the intimacy of human connection. In the end, what draws people back isn't just the charm of the old ways. It's the feeling of being part of something larger than themselves. Nostalgia has become a compass, pointing toward a future that doesn't forget its roots. Because after everything laws, rules, and digital revolutions, one truth has never faded. Laws change. Rules shift. But the heart of America has always been the same. The search for freedom. Looking back across the decades, the picture is complicated. There were days of open truck beds, smoke-filled diners, and handshake deals that felt unshakable. There were also laws that excluded, overlooked, or left people vulnerable. The past wasn't perfect, but it held a rawness, a looseness, that gave Americans a sense of life lived on their own terms. That is what lingers most, the memory of a time when freedom felt untamed, even when it carried risks. Laws, after all, are not just rules on paper. They are mirrors of culture, reflecting what a society values, fears, and protects. In one era, safety was secondary to independence. In another, fairness rose as a demand that could no longer be ignored. With each shift, America revealed something about itself, not just what it wanted to restrict, but what it wanted to preserve. The balance has never been easy. Safety often requires structure, but too much structure can feel like chains. Freedom invites risk, yet too much risk leaves scars. Every generation has had to decide where that line should be drawn, and every answer has shaped daily life in ways both small and immense. From playgrounds to highways, from workplaces to living rooms, rules and freedoms have danced together in a constant push and pull. And yet, beneath all those changes, one truth has remained. Americans value freedom not only as a right, but as a feeling. It's the thrill of a child riding a bike until the streetlights come on. It's the trust of a neighbor's handshake. It's the determination of activists who refuse to accept laws that excluded them. Freedom has always been the point, even when the rules seem to argue otherwise. That's why nostalgia carries such weight. When people remember the past, they don't just recall the rules, they recall the feeling. The laughter that rose from a smoke-filled diner, the long car rides with the wind in their hair, the sense of belonging on a busy main street. These memories remind us that laws are temporary, but the desire for connection and self-determination runs far deeper. The past offers both caution and comfort. It shows us what happens when freedom goes unchecked, and it reminds us of what's lost when rules grow too rigid. It challenges us to preserve what matters most, not the exact laws, but the values they carried: independence, trust, and community. Because at the end of it all, America's story isn't about rules. It's about the people who lived within them, pushed against them, and redefined them. Freedom was always the heartbeat, pulsing through every chapter. Which of these old rules would you bring back? Share your thoughts below.